Thank you for joining us in this session today. I am going to share my screen, and I'm very excited to be here with you. Um, as I mentioned earlier, I am not a PowerPoint girl, so we've got it to work out well. Today's session, as mentioned by Laura, is being led by me, Christyn Freemon, and in discussion with Angela Taylor. Both of us are community residents in Garfield Park, and really taking some time to showcase some of the things that we've gone through, really with the loss of a grocery store, but some of the issues in the neighborhood started before that. So today's session will focus around the loss of the Aldi in our neighborhood, but we'll bring in a number of other points for a community-led blueprint for food access, shared ownership, and what we are referring to as ancestral intelligence born in Garfield Park. So really wanting to highlight that community is the solution. And so while there are many titles and names and terms and organizations that are thrown around, a lot of times people are often questioning what they have the ability to do. And the answer is usually within community. So we want to highlight what opportunities we were able to leverage, how we organized and built on our own terms. And so for those who are in the room that are community organizers, food justice advocates, even those who play in the real estate development space, there's room for all of us to build lasting change for our neighborhoods and our communities. So we are coining ourselves as architects of legacy, as these change makers, with the understanding that the work that we are doing is going to live beyond us. And in my pleasure of doing this work, I have the opportunity to stand on the shoulders of the likes of Miss Angela Taylor, to bring to fruition what self-determination does look like in our community. And so at this point, Miss Angela, let the folks know who you are if they don't already know.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It would be right at that pivotal point. My hands would get a little shaky, and to release that unmute button so I can say good morning to you all. My name is Angela Taylor, and I serve as the Wellness Coordinator for the Garfield Park Community Council. I live here in the community that I've served, and it's been a great pleasure to join Kristen and her team in bringing to fruition a community grocery store, something that is needed in every community, and most communities do have, but we happen to be amiss here in Garfield Park. But the work that we're doing together as community residents, that we're very, very hopeful and assured that something will happen in a way of being able to present a grocery store to the residents here in Garfield Park.
Thank you, Miss Angela. And again, I am Christyn Freemon, a community resident. I have lived on the west side of Chicago for about 20 years, specifically in East Garfield Park at this point. And my role in this community has been a lot. So working with organizations like GPCC, there are a number of us who were intentional about doing development in the neighborhood and supporting developers and organizations to pretty much restructure what we know the legacy really is of the neighborhood. And so when you talk about any sort of community development, it's not just about the built environment or buildings, it really is about the people. And so looking at education, looking at food access, transportation, all of the elements that really go into developing community, there were a number of us who sat at a table, both formally and informally. So these were a lot of kitchen table conversations, a lot of meetups on Saturdays, a lot of kind of questions about what do we have the ability to influence, specifically looking at Madison and Pulaski as that anchoring point. Jim Webb, who was advertised to attend today's session, unfortunately is double booked. He is in a capacity building session for developers. So really trying to shore up his development skills. But I do want to be sure to emphasize the role that he has played in doing this, particularly because he was integral in calling me and a number of colleagues to the table to say, hey, I think we can actually make change. And if we look at Madison and Pulaski as a centralized point of that change, we can really have influence on what can happen in the neighborhood. That conversation happened about 2018. There's a white paper that we developed. And so giving credit to the other players who are at the table who are not necessarily still involved with the organization and some who are still at the table doing their thing. So Marshall Hatch Jr., with My for Redemption Project, Theodore TJ Crawford, who is the former executive director of the Garfield Park Right to Wellness Collaborative, Jim Webb, who is the head of Nation Builders in True Delta, and myself, as well as a number of other organizations. But we pulled together a white paper to identify what those elements were, not knowing that in 2021, in the middle of a national or a global disaster of COVID, that an anchor of our community would essentially leave in the middle of the night. And so, what we want to talk about today is really the necessity of identifying opportunities for shared language. Because there are so many players at the table, and I think when you're working across silos, what we end up finding is there might be the similar words, but they have different meanings to different people. So we want to make sure that we highlight some shared vocabulary. And I will be dropping in the chat while Miss Angela talks. I don't want to do it while I'm talking because I'm scared I'll mess something up technologically. But I will drop in a glossary for your review and you'll have access to it at any point in time. But it will reference some of the language that we are mentioning. Real stories from real models. Like we are in the midst of this right now. The grocery store is not built yet. We have been doing years of work, years, and when I say years, Miss Angela has been doing food access work before the loss of the grocery store, but knowing that food access was still an issue when we had a grocery store. Practical framework. So we want to really give some opportunity to provide some insight on how we've been doing some of the things that we've been doing, both in the shared ownership space and cooperative models to support other organizations who might want to duplicate or replicate what they can, where they can. And then for you guys who are listening, just thinking about what you can take back to your neighborhoods. There are some things that I know are pretty much based on timing, but there are some things that are real lessons learned that can influence some of the efforts that you are working on. And as mentioned, while we talk about the crisis of the loss of the Aldi, and that is at pretty much the start of what's called West Garfield Park. So within the neighborhood, we have a physical, beautiful, approximately 200-acre park, phenomenal green space in the neighborhood that has a number of amenities, but it is a physical space. So while the neighborhood is divided, East and West Garfield Park, the park is actually the divider. Organizing started before the loss of the grocery store. So really wanting to emphasize that we are not starting the work after the Aldi departed. The work was started prior to that. And Miss Angela has been integral in that food access work. And so looking at this as somewhat of a framework to duplicate community organizing very early on is extremely important. Miss Angela, do you want to talk about the organizing efforts?
Yeah, I can speak to the work prior to us losing the Aldis, which as a community we felt was not enough. So what I was helpful in organizing is a network of community gardens. And what came out of those community gardens was food. With the food that came out of the community gardens, we stood up a neighborhood market, which, if you visualize that, is very similar to a farmer's market. So we're a group of farmers, not on a large scale like an actual farm, but community farmers where we grow food and we stand up a neighborhood market twice a month in season. And it's another place where residents can come to and shop and get the freshest hyperlocal produce that's available, I would say, to any place across the country, because there are gardens that you can walk to from the site of where we host the neighborhood market. Most of that produce is picked the day before the farmer's market is stood up, so it's not going to get fresher than that. We know most of the produce that we find in our grocery stores is at least 3 weeks old before it hit that grocery store shelf. We're proud to say that our produce is only a day old, and not quite even a day, because if we harvest on Friday and you have access to it on Saturday, I think that's as fresh as you can get. And the community response to it is they show up when they know that we're there and they purchase. We have been able to sustain our neighborhood market for 14 seasons this year. That's magnificent because it is grassroots grown, not going to a store and purchasing some items, specifically what you will find and be able to purchase at our neighborhood market is actually grown right in the community. And I just want to give my community a hand clap because it's phenomenal. The work we do as residents, nobody is paid staff. We show up and we show out because we realized our community had a need. And as Christyn mentioned, this was why the Aldi's was still here. So with that being said, we've doubled down since the Aldi's has left to make sure and ensure that if necessary, you could go to one of these gardens and be able to harvest and weigh and purchase directly from the community garden. Kudos for the gardens in the network to be able to do that. Christyn, back to you.
My apologies. I am having a couple of tech difficulties now, even though we spent all this time going through. Wanting to make sure that I had the appropriate slide up for our garden network because Miss Angela has a beautiful garden, and it would be remiss if you did not have an opportunity to see that garden. Um, she has invited a number of us to be in community physically in that space. And so it is also incredibly important that as we talk about community organizing, we are thoughtful about the physical spaces that allow that to happen. Are you guys able to see the garden image? Okay, perfect. Um, and it is one thing when we talk about the work, as she mentioned, it's hard. It is not, I don't want to make this seem like it's an easy thing to do. It has been difficult. It has been a labor of love. It's been loss associated with it. And so it is also extremely important for us to identify the partnerships that you are going to need to call on before you know you'll need to call on them. So this is not a crisis happens, then you respond. It is we have already identified an issue and there is going to be a crisis. That is really what's happened. So West Garfield Park and Garfield Park have a number of concerns that are associated with health access. We talk about what's called a death gap. So within the neighborhood, we are experiencing a 20-year life expectancy gap to where West Garfield Park residents are dying 20 years earlier than downtown counterparts. And so with those things, when we first started the work, or when I first started the work, that number was 13 years. And then COVID happened and that number jumped to 20 years. And so we're realistic that this is really all hands on deck. This is not one organization can fix the problem. This is not a silver bullet can fix the problem. And so as we are looking at what some of these solutions look like, it is the acknowledgement that there is the necessity of an ecosystem. And so as mentioned, the crisis and being that moment that was the pivoting, galvanizing moment. And so Aldi left our neighborhood overnight. It was really you're driving down the street, Aldi's open one day, and then we're getting calls like, hey, the Aldi is not open. And when I got that call, I was like, well, maybe something happened. Maybe they had an outage. Maybe it was like a temporary thing. But when it was confirmed to be a final real shuttering, they're not open, um, it was a little daunting. And as mentioned, this is already in the middle of COVID. This is in the middle of us addressing a number of things. So some of the organizations that galvanized, Miss Angela and I are founding members of a collaborative called the Garfield Park Right to Wellness Collaborative. That organization ultimately ended up winning the Chicago Prize. I am on a development team that is developing a space that's separate from this one, but all of us are committed to this work. And so when you look at this slide, what is represented here is the 11 founding organizations of the Right to Wellness Collaborative and the former executive director of that organization. And so because the Aldi left, we had to mobilize and mobilize quickly, not to just mobilize the city to say, hey, you have to do something, but also to mobilize other partners to feed the need, like literally to feed people. And so within the corridor of what we're facing, we have an open air drug market, we have low income population, we're facing violence. And so to add on not having food access, um, it was very extreme and it felt very intense in that moment. Miss Angela, I saw you come off mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to that fact a quick response that we were able to activate our pop-up grocery store that we stood up for 60 days, three times since the shuttering of the Aldi store. It was an experience, an opportunity for us to gather information from residents that came to shop at the grocery store about what they would anticipate and be looking for when we got a new grocery store to come. Over the last few years, as we've hosted the pop-up grocery store, we've collected more than 900 surveys from residents, giving us direction in the way that we should move and ensure that once a grocery operator was identified, it would be a grocery store that's for us and by us.
So that's that ancestral intelligence. When we talk about collective movement, that is really tying into cooperative economics. It is tying into collective mobility. And in this case, we are incorporating shared ownership models as well. So what Miss Angela didn't mention was a part of those surveys and conversations also gauge community residents about their interest in having some level of ownership in the grocery store. So what is pictured here is Miss Angela setting up the pop-up, and it did operate along Madison. So in between the site of where the Sankofa Wellness Village and these three developments are being built, as well as the loss of the Aldi, was where this pop-up was located. So the other thing that we are facing in the community within the corridor is we don't have a lot of easily move-in spaces, so we don't have a lot of retail-ready spaces. A number of our spaces in the corridor require an extensive amount of renovation. So when she is saying we were able to mobilize and open up this pop-up grocery store, it was not an easy feat. It's like, okay, we're already dealing with a number of limited assets. This is not an initiative that we have gotten funding for. And so pulling together partners to say, hey, we need to mobilize dollars and mobilize quickly. We have organizations like Rush at the Table and Westside United who were able to stand this up and support. There were other partners, Miss Angela, any that you want to identify specifically?
We would like to identify the Blackhawks because they did sponsor the pop-up for a 45-day period. And having partners to step up to the plate at that time because it costs money, you need equipment, you need produce items. And again, we were happy to say that as well as the Garden Network, we have a local produce vendor that was able to assist us to make sure that our grocery store shelves were stocked and we had things that the residents would be excited to purchase.
So when we talk about that cultural or ancestral intelligence, Miss Angela was very thoughtful to get the input of community because aside from just saying we need fresh food, it's also coupling with what are people going to eat. So when we are identifying opportunities to feed folks, sometimes if you do a food giveaway and you're not giving people what they actually want, you see a lot of waste. You see the boxes get thrown through. And so we notice that. You might have a gallon of milk on the side because community has moved away from drinking dairy or whole milk or red top. And so as we're putting these things together, it is tapping into really what we're asking people to participate as well. So, some of the things that we want to make sure we emphasize, both in the Garden Network as well as in the development, is that this is an iterative process, but it's also one where we're just not doing things for you. We don't want to lean into what we call clientelism. So, meaning you're not just coming here to take, this is not just charity, we are working arm in arm, hand in hand. This is mutual. What do you need? What can we provide? Who can we get it from? And then also tapping into those anchors. So when we're mentioning some of these organizations, it's not that they're that far off. On the basis of where the Blackhawks are, which is tied to the United Center, which for those of you who have been following, that is a part of the 1901 development. That is about a mile, maybe a mile and a half to the east, and I'm being very generous. It is a quick hop, skipping away from where we are. And so we are within a footprint of some of these anchor institutions. Rush specifically said while they are a West Side based organization further east, coming to a neighborhood like West Garfield Park, who is experiencing these things, needs to be a part of how they are looking at their equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. And while that language may be bad words at this point federally, the reality is you can't lift up one neighborhood and ignore another neighborhood and think we're all going to be okay. So it is going back to some of the things that some folks may have left behind. And for us in West Garfield Park, what we've explicitly talked about is Sankofa Black Culture Wellness. So what are we doing to go back and retrieve the things that are important to us and retrieve the things that we have forgotten or lost or left behind? If Jim were here, he would give the analogy about you left your keys at the house and you are trying to unlock a door and you cannot unlock the door without those keys. So Sankofa is us going back to get those keys to unlock the greatness that we know exists in our communities and our neighborhoods that haven't had necessarily the more recent chance to thrive. And so I do want to pause here to see, and I will check, I guess, check the chat to see if we have any questions that I may have missed. Ooh, okay. So far, I don't see any questions. So I will continue. Um, as Miss Angela mentioned, we have been doing a lot of work. So what I'm showing now is an example of collective work and responsibility. So when the Aldi left, aside from doing the pop-ups, aside from tapping into the markets, there was also a push for the city to get involved. At the time that we did this initiative, West Garfield Park was not a community area that had been designated as Invest Southwest. Invest Southwest was an initiative under the previous mayoral administration that was supposed to drive commercial corridor investment to the south and the west sides. West Garfield Park was not on that radar. Once we lost the grocery store, a number of us pushed. Myself, Jim Webb, Miss Angela, Mike Tomas, um, Aisha from Westside United, we pushed and pushed and pushed. A number of times, some folks might call us aggressive, but when you experience this level of atrocity at this consistent level, and let's also level set. I don't know if you guys know the history of the West Side or understand some of the dynamics that we are facing, but we had not seen any major significant investment since the assassination of Martin Luther King. That's 1968. The West Side burned after he was killed. The mayor at the time issued a shoot to kill order. So if you see people looting, shoot them. This is not made up. It is verified WTTW. If you watch any of the documentaries on the West Side, this is what Senior Daly said about West Side residents. And prior to Martin Luther King being killed, there were a number of racial unrest things that happened. A young lady got killed by a drunk person driving a fire truck. The fire truck hit a light pole. The light pole fell on the girl. The girl died. There was a race riot that occurred. But what ended up happening was the race riots in LA, the Watts riots. That happened around the same time. And so you didn't hear as much about what was happening on the west side of Chicago. But when you drive through the west side, and sometimes you feel like before a lot of the development has started to happen, you're like, why does it look like a war zone? Why does it look like it burned down? Because it did. And we experienced a significant amount of disinvestment on purpose. Administration said, we're not doing anything over there. We're not putting any money over there. And so realistically, there had been a lot of blight. So moving towards that, when you have a lot of blight, you have a lot of poverty, then people are doing things. So a shadow economy builds up very strong. So we also are dealing with open air drug market. We have an opioid crisis. So you have people who are on the end of selling the drugs and using the drugs to deal with what they're facing. Economic injustice translates to injustice in so many ways. And so you have over policing, you have this ripple effect. And so we're dealing in a corridor that at the time had not seen significant development, new development. You're seeing a lot of vacant lots, you're seeing a lot of blight, and then we lose the grocery store in the middle of COVID. We pushed the city to get involved because at that point, we also had another grocery store issue with our Save a Lot. So Save a Lot is not along the Madison corridor, but it is at the Jackson intersection, which is within again a mile. Like if you were to draw it on a map, it's not far either. So Save a Lot, for those who don't know, is not a full service grocery store. It is typically a limited grocery store that you find in low income communities. And so with the Aldi going, that had a little more variety of what they would typically offer, now we have the Save a Lot. And the Save a Lot thing got shut down due to health code violations. So not only do we lose the Aldi, but we have an issue with the only other like major grocery store that's not like a little corner store on the corridor. And when I say issue, there were over 700 rat droppings found during a health code violation. People are not wearing their masks. The coolers are not adequately temperatured. And again, all this information is public through the health department because they're the ones who provided these records. So we're also not only just advocating for the loss of the grocery store, we're advocating for this other grocer to do better. Miss Angela, is there anything you want to add about Save a Lot?
Well, I will say Save a Lot has tried to develop a community relationship. If we call on them, they do come out. They do talk with community about what has been identified as issues within the store. And since they reopened last fall, they have been very diligent about having appropriate staffing, making sure the store is well lit, making and ensuring that those coolers are being kept at the correct temperatures. And yeah, I did tell them, you never know when I may come back and stick my finger over and touch something. I'm not looking to see meat packaged in the cooler and the plastic on the meat swole up because then we know it's a issue. I do want to give a little credit to the Save a Lot team because they have been very diligent in engaging community overall. I am going to call them a community partner at this time because they're being intentional in listening to that community and responding to what community, not just myself, but a group of residents, tell them that's needed. They're open to a community advisory committee, again, not just me saying this is wrong, but a group of us that meet monthly on the second Tuesday and discuss things that they are very open in responding to what we say is needed. After they reopened, it was identified an issue with the garbage, the trash takeout. They increased the number of days during the week that the garbage is picked up with their expense. They're not waiting for the city to come by and pick that garbage up. They're paying for 2 additional times during the week to ensure that they can keep down and attempt to eradicate the rodent issue that they previously had, and to make sure again that the products is fresh in the store and that the store is well lit, that the parking lot is well lit, so people can feel safe to come there and to shop. Back to you, Christyn.
And that took time, right? Like, this is not, again, this is not one conversation. This is not two conversations. And it's not like there was a start of one thing and a stop to another. All of this is happening at the same time. And so as we go back to the Madison and Hamlin site, we pushed the city to buy the Aldi, and they subsequently decided to try to assemble a larger opportunity for development. So when they released the request for proposal, it wasn't just for the Aldi site, but they said, create a vision for the entire block. I am a part of the team that was one of two respondents to that request for proposal. There were only two responses. So I saw a question about why there has not been more grocery stores in West Garfield Park. Grocery is very hard. So while food is a need, the margins to make the business work are difficult. And so it is one of those things where there is a mix of necessity of having a large enough size of store. And then there's also the other thing that's really a poor tax. So when you live in underserved neighborhoods, things like insurance cost you more because of the incidences that you may have to face to call on the insurance. So even when we were doing some underwriting for other projects, we're looking at insurance, like how much it costs to insure a space that's been vacant. They look at the length of time of the vacancy, so how long the space has been unoccupied or nothing has been there. And all of those things go to influence the rates of what you're ending up, or what that business is ending up paying. And so when you have a grocery store where the margins, and even if it's in a good neighborhood, margins are thin. So there are things that groceries will do to supplement those margins. So it might be selling liquor, it might be catering, you might have other things besides food that have a higher markup to supplement what they may be losing on the actual food side. So like a hot bar, the markup on hot bars is really good. And so within West Garfield, Aldi said they left because they were losing too much money. They publicly said it, but at the time that they left, it wasn't like they notified. They said they had reached out to the city prior to indicate those issues. But on the ground communication, I'm like, well, if they were talking to some of the organizations on the ground, I think they may have had a better outcome to be able to address some of the concerns, because there are mechanisms. We've got a special service area that does security. There are organizations like INVC that are doing anti-violence work. There are a number of organizations that offer social services. So if you have a theft problem, maybe these are people who actually have issues that need to be supported in another way, and they're stealing food to subsidize that. So instead of saying, okay, let's call the police or let's just pull out, there are other means of community engagement that I think can be looked at that are not falling within a traditional corporate structure. So it may not be something that's thought about as a mechanism to support development on a longer term basis. And this brings us to this team. I'm a part of the Westgate team, which is led by Jim Webb. Jim is the founder of True Delta, and he is also doing a number of development projects in West Garfield Park. One is called Hub 32, which is located across from the hatchery. And again, another site that's been vacant for 50 years that people have said, I remember when I was a child and there was something there, or I remember my mother telling me there was something there, or I remember when the building was torn down. So we are reactivating spaces that have been chronically vacant. That particular project is by, again, Lake and Kedzie, right across the hatchery. It's an ETOD. Another development that he's working on, he just got awarded missing middle, so there'll be some residential components to that. And the work that he and I do together outside of development, we have founded a nonprofit called Fahodier Foundation. Fahodier is a word that means independence. And so as we talk about self-determination and independence, we are looking for mechanisms to include people in processes who typically may not be included. Um, Jim was very intentional about pulling together this development team to respond to the opportunity to replace the grocery store and ultimately re-envision what a pretty important component of our block was. So Madison and Pulaski at one point was one of the top commercial shopping districts in the city of Chicago. Madison and Hamlin is 2 blocks east of that. So Pulaski is 4,000 West, Hamlin is 3,800 West. And the development that the city asked for a response for was the 38 to the 3,900 block. So that's pretty much in that major shopping district. At that time, we also ended up losing the White Castle that was in that block as well. And so what Jim wanted to do in assembling this team was, number one, to lift up Black developers. It was very important for him to be inclusive of folks who typically are not easily able to participate in real estate development processes due to the fact that they are very expensive. And when you do something with the city, it's very long and time is money. So right now, we have been awarded that development. The team includes CBBC, which is Citizens for Building a Better Community. Both Jim and Melvin will talk about their history in making not the best decisions when they were younger, but that also gives them the insight to be able to grab some of the people who are not making the best decisions now and to say, hey, look at me and the way I've turned my life around. Tapping into Eastlake, I know folks may have some issues with them on the property management side, but they have been one of the top employers to hiring people who have backgrounds who can't get hired anywhere else. So Jim has personally been hired by Eastlake. Eastlake has worked extensively with Melvin as well. And so Eastlake is the major development partner on this. So we talk about what's called a mentor protege arrangement. On the construction and contracting side, it's a mentor protege arrangement with Eastlake being that mentor, True Delta being that protege. And Jim was also very intentional about bringing in CBBC because of Melvin's work in the neighborhood. He said, I do not want to fight against this person. We should not be divided. How can we come together? And so he was very intentional about inviting him to participate in his company to participate on the team. My role through this company, I have a consulting company called Project Forward. Project Forward is a part of that structure. And then the architecture team is Valerio DeWalt Train with, again, another mentor protege arrangement with Leighton Design. And so our response to this proposal not only thought about two things, we thought about the built environment from the standpoint of what does this asset look like. And so these books are from Jim's library. Jim has done extensive travel across Africa and has been very thoughtful about how does a built environment influence how people behave. And so part of the challenge in real estate development is the cheapest thing is cookie cutter. Like when you start to see these designs that look the same, it's cookie cutter because it's cheap. But we wanted to be intentional about how does the architecture make people feel? So while we know we need to have a grocery store, we also thought about how does the physical look of this space make residents want to engage to feel like this space is for them. So he gave all of these books here are from his personal library to give to the architecture team to be thoughtful about the incorporation, again, of diaspora for us. So as we're looking at a community that for the west side of Chicago, a lot of people migrated from the South. A lot of people who live in the neighborhood can trace maybe 2 generations back, in some cases 1 generation back, to the Southern US. A lot of us came from Mississippi, Alabama. Miss Angela, where's your family from?
I'm sorry, I think I'm gonna leave my mic on. My father's from Mississippi and my mother is from Arkansas. So yes, I do have a inbred history in my Southern roots that I truly love, and a part of what's helped me to bring my projects to life here in Chicago.
So a lot of Miss Angela is a legacy resident. And so a lot of residents who've been in the community for a very long time are one generation removed from the South. And so as we think about what does it look like to incorporate the components of the Southern US, as well as prior to that, African diaspora into physical environment, our proposal, that is why the proposal looks the way it does. In addition to that, it's the acknowledgement also of Afrofuturism. So, what does our future look like? Oftentimes, we talk about Black history without the consideration of like, what does the Black future look like? And how are we intentional about its creation? And so, our design and response and proposal was thoughtful about how are we inclusive throughout the process? How do we involve ownership throughout the process? And so ultimately, we have a letter of intent from a Black owned grocer who is tied to a faith based institution. So while the for profit itself, or the grocery store is a for profit itself, Living Fresh is that we have that LOI from Living Fresh. I do think the fact that they are a faith based organization lends into their desire for equitable food access. So it was not easy for us to get a letter of intent for a grocer to come to the neighborhood because the footprint also, that was the other part of that equation. When we talk about the grocery store, the size of the grocery store. So when we first lost to Aldi, people, the very first thing people said is, hey, call Liz, who's doing 40 acres. I call Liz, and at this point, her grocery store was not open. Liz said, I got to get this grocery store off the ground before I can evaluate any other project. She said, let me get past this first. And that's also the reality, capacity. So we have to be very thoughtful. This grocery store's budget for development and it's not the total development price. We had to get it down to about 45 million. The grocery store is about 10 to 12 million, 10 to 12 million dollars. In a community whose median income on paper, because that does not acknowledge the shadow economy and how money is moving, on paper is $24,000. The math doesn't math on paper for grocery to easily come. That's why you're not seeing grocery stores knock down the doors. But what you do see in our corridor is an overconcentration on stores that sell athletic apparel and stores that sell gym shoes for $250 and releases that have people around the corner. So when you match up things like, okay, well, there's income for this, but you don't have the paper income for grocery, this is why we have to be able to understand how to tell an alternative story. So, on the basis of our cultural competency, we had to be able to tell another story. We understand when there's an open air drug market, that means there's unclocked and undocumented money. Whether or not how we feel about it, it creates another problem, but it also means that there is a source of cash flow that is not showing up on the books. And so that is why you'll see two of the same athletic apparel stores within a mile of each other within our commercial corridor. We got two, at one point, we had three Foot Lockers. We had the regular Foot Locker, the woman's Foot Locker, and the kids' Foot Locker. So, the same way you see Targets or Starbucks in other neighborhoods, we have a high concentration and over indexing of athletic apparel because that's where people are choosing to spend their money. We also have a lot of hair salons, another cash based business with unverifiable income. So, while we know that on the books, income says it's one thing, we believe that it's not as low as it is. And so we are able to tell that story and also leaning into this other component of shared ownership. People want to feel engaged in their community, not just to be told what they can buy, but to have an opportunity to own. And so my explicit part of this project is to develop legally the vehicle for that to happen. So this is a slide that came from a program that Miss Angela had. I had the pleasure of her participating in our very first pilot cohort of what we called Good Anchor Fellows. So with the help of Fahodier Foundation, my organization Project Forward on the consulting side, we have been developing curriculum to be able to educate community around how a community investment vehicle comes to play. What is the real estate development process? Because the other thing is we are way off the timeline that we have been telling community, but that is because the timeline is out of our control at this point. So the city had given us a timeline, and so we're still doing our due diligence on the other side. So there's the physical real estate that's happening, and then there's all the other things. So we've talked to other interested tenants. We have a number of folks that are ready to come into the community to start their businesses or expand their businesses. We've got full service restaurants. We've got fitness facilities and practitioners and things that we were intentional about adding to the fabric of the corridor. But the thing that I'm probably the most excited about is how does cooperative economics show up in this building? And so from a deal structure standpoint, we want the space or the real estate to be owned by community. So one of the things that we initially evaluated, as Miss Angela mentioned, the Community Grocery Initiative is the organization that has continued to convene community around grocery food access. The surveys initially were around shared ownership via a worker cooperative model. We as the development team cannot dictate how the business operates. So we're still in conversations to say, hey, do you have any opportunities for ownership? Do you have any opportunities for any level of ownership? Will you consider an ESOP, an employee stock option program? Will you consider training someone so ultimately we can continue to propagate smaller groceries? But what we as the development team have in our power to do is to say, we can own and share the ownership of the real estate. And so a community investment vehicle includes local residents, other stakeholders, which when we say other stakeholders, we are talking about funders and institutions. And as Ms. Angela mentioned, the partners like the Blackhawks or Rush or other anchor organizations that are invested in the neighborhood to be able to support standing up real estate projects that ultimately can have a level of ownership and appreciation and therefore revenue once these things become cash flow positive, that community who will typically be displaced when these things happen have an opportunity for inclusion. So a community investment vehicle allows residents to pool their financial resources to buy and control neighborhood real estate assets. This could be multifamily, this could be mixed use projects. For us, I am working on another project called the K that has a CIV shared ownership element, and that's an innovation space. This is a mixed use development. So CIVs are opportunities for collective ownership. And while the term CIV is new, it is tapping into what historically has been already done. Communities have bought real estate together collectively for a very long time. They just didn't have a fancy name called the CIV attached to it. Miss Angela, is there anything you want to add either about the worker-owned co-ops or the Good Anchor program?
I would only add this very short tidbit. I think us as community will respond and will do better if we're invested in what comes to the community. Because ownership, if you own your favorite pair of shoes or that black dress that you enjoy, you're going to wear it and you're going to get it clean and you're going to tuck it away and make sure it's well kept for the next time you need to pull it out. This is how I see these opportunities that this group specifically is going through community to ensure that it is educated in what it is actually that's being asked and what the community will need to do to ensure that we, not they, but we are able to stand it up and breathe life into it. That's my 2 cents, Kristen.
Miss Angela always has amazing 2 cents. That is why I like if I could find a little clapping thing for her right now, I would, but I'm scared I'll go through all my slides. So you're gonna get a real clap. Um, and again, Miss Angela is one of many elders that I have the pleasure of being able to serve with. There are a number of folks at the table, and I'm not saying community work is easy. I'm not saying we always all get along. Miss Angela called to try to fuss at me the other day, but we worked it out. We worked it out. Um, and it's all in love, though. What I will say is a lot of people have love for the neighborhood. And I think that a lot of things that are bubbling up are either out of fear of what they are afraid will happen or fear of what has already happened. So we also have to be very honest about the amount of trauma that our communities have suffered and continue to suffer and how that shows up. And so one of the things with me being an economic development practitioner, so I didn't really go into my like professional background earlier, but I have worked with businesses and corridors throughout my career. And when I say I've worked with them, my role has been the very first nonprofit organization I worked at was a community development finance institution. And I started that role in 2008. So when the economy was tanking. So when I say I went to work all happy because I was like, oh, there's an organization that is giving financing to communities up to $500,000, and it's not a bank, and it's focused on women and minorities and those that are in LMI neighborhoods. And then the recession hit. And so what we're experiencing now, they say millennials have gone through all the disasters. I'm going through another disaster. But it does also give the opportunity for hope and resilience. And so the frameworks that I've had the pleasure of developing are not just shaped because these are wishful thinking. It's shaped by 10,000 man hours of my professional experience doing work, not just in Chicago, but I've also done work in Detroit around their food access things. And I've worked with organizations who've created policy that Detroit's now on their third or fourth round of reiteration of how do you get food into communities that are typically underserved. And nobody has an easy answer. But one of the things that we have talked about is an approach to additionally shared ownership, but looking at integrated capital. So the acknowledgement that there is a mechanism or a way to name other capital that is beyond financial capital that ultimately can translate into financial capital. And often communities who are underserved have these forms of capital. They just don't get acknowledged in the same way. So we created a framework for that language to occur in conjunction to the community investment vehicle. And on our end, through the nonprofit, we're doing the education for that. So we call it Fish Capital. We did our first cohort with 14 leaders, a mix of organizational leaders who are West Garfield or Garfield Park based, as well as those that will be moving into the other development that we're working on, partially so we could create a community of those that are already doing this work, but creating more shared language amongst us. So it's very intentional so that if we're all going in the same direction, and so sometimes words like equity can be a little broad. What we did with this framework was not only to name these names, but there's an accompanying rubric that goes along with this so that people can say, okay, well, when I say intellectual capital, or I say spiritual capital, or I say social capital, or here are the forms of capital that I'm explicitly talking about, and here's how I can measure it over a period of time. So we're giving people a tool to measure and not something to move the goalposts, because we also know in this space, politics will change goalposts. And so what was equity yesterday is not equity today. And that's not what we want to happen with this. We want a process that we know already is nuanced, because real estate development is not It's not easy and it's not straightforward. And it's a mix of an art and science. And community development is the same thing. So we created this framework as a mechanism to um, create these opportunities for having conversations and to be able to effectively keep the goalposts the same for community residents. And so Fahodie has hosted its first cohort in conjunction and support with GPCC. We both were organizations. Well, actually, True Delta and GPCC were the organizations that received community wealth building money. GPCC utilized theirs in target of the grocery store. We utilized ours just in target of training community residents as a part of what our incubation center will offer. So these are things that we just don't want to offer when the building opens. We are looking at what does it look like to support corridor development as a whole, as a whole. What does it look like to support community residents along this process? And how do we give people the shared language to be able to not only engage with us, but engage with the community in their own circle of influence? Um, and so we wanted to make sure that we called out some of the things that don't get acknowledged when we typically say capital. So intellectual capital being the knowledge, the skills, and experience. And again, because we also acknowledge that we have a shared or we have a shadow economy in community, there is a level of intellect that is occurring that may not be traditional educational aptitude. And so I still remember one of our funders coming to a meeting and we were having a groundbreaking for one of the projects that Miss Angela worked on was a conversion of a vacant lot, a vacant city-owned lot into a green space that has a skating rink and a park, and we utilize it multiple times now. But one of the funders was driving to the event, and she said, "Oh, there are some young men that are selling some really prettily packaged products about a block away." I said they were drugs. She said, "No, no, no. The packaging was phenomenal. Like it was really good marketing." I said there were drugs. And this is why we're trying to create workforce pipelines for a community who you see they have a certain skill set. They're not using it in the best way that optimizes everything in the neighborhood. But she was very impressed with the level of the prettiness of those packages. And so we are understanding that there is also the draw of spirituality in the community. So not just from a standpoint of saying, okay, we got a lot of churches, but the one thing that I can say about the West Side is that I feel like it's a different, a more home-like environment, a more let me know my neighbor environment, a more do I know you? I'm more protective because I don't know you, I don't know your family, and because I've been here for 30 years, I don't know your family. So let me call around and see. That is an element of connectivity. Um, Also the acknowledgement that we are connected. So not just from a religious standpoint, but saying, if I am hurt, you are hurt. And if you are hurt, I am hurting. And so getting people to understand that while they may feel some of their individualized situations are harmful to them, if we don't act collectively, it's harmful to the whole. Social, we have very strong social networks. Same thing with human, environmental, and digital. And so environmental for us, partially because within Black communities and Brown communities, these are neighborhoods that are often overly dumped. These are the places that we have a lot of issues with environmental that ties into our healthcare, our health issues that show up. Um, Wanting to make sure that we are intentional both about what does that capital and protection and stewardship look like, and then just the environment that you are also surrounding yourself in. So who are you spending time with? Who are your social networks? Where are you getting your information from? And then finally, digital. And that one was added because despite the fact of residents not necessarily having consistent digital access and we still having a technological gap, what we do over index in, and this is backed up by Pew Research, our communities are often the earliest adopters of digital technology that's accessible by mobile. So if you can do it on your phone, this is ways that information is being shared. This is also information like the way people are learning. So TikTok, like we have been able to go viral on TikTok because we've adopted some of the younger participants in the neighborhood who have a following that I don't have. But she's able to get 15,000 views of just showing the work that we already do on a regular basis. And so this is a framework that we've created that we've been talking about as a mechanism of integrated capital that leans into this shared ownership model to support more adoption. And so we're also working on mechanizing how do we support those who may not have the same amount of money to invest, but have other forms of capital to invest. So we're really not only saying, how are we setting up this legal structure, which is a whole thing within itself. We had to secure specialized attorneys that essentially were initially brought to us because we had received the funding from the city of Chicago and they had the technical assistance contract. That's how we met them. We could not engage them through that contract because the city took so long to actually execute the contract that the firm got worried. They're like, well, we don't know. We can't do all this work up front and wait to be paid. Meanwhile, Miss Angela has a delegate agency contract. I'm pursuing a delegate agency contract. And we just kind of understand, like, hey, that's just the way the city works. We know we know they'll execute it, but it's not in the time frame in which they say. So we have a firm that is specialized and they are setting up shared ownership models, not for only us, but they've done it for South Shore and they've done it nationally with other organizations across the United States who are trying to create models and have created models to allow for access for people who typically don't have access. The other thing was that we did again was that Good Anchor Fellowship cohort. And so we are communicating those values. And on our end, our next thing is to continue to raise money from institutional investors to make sure that we have enough pipeline and timeline to train community residents, because what we're offering, as Miss Angela said, it's not typical. You don't typically have a developer come into the neighborhood and say, you know what, I'm gonna give you ownership in the building that we're building. That's not what happens. So we're being faced with a level of skepticism. We're being faced with a level of questions. We're being faced with a level of just not understanding the real estate process. So it's like, well, you said y'all were gonna break ground. We still don't have site control of the building yet. And that's in the hands of the city. And we can't do anything about it. And so the best we can do is continue to try to educate people as we're going along this process, but also making sure that they can participate and not be pushed out. So this is why it's so important to have other players at the table. So we've got other workforce organizations. We have hospitals who are trying to hire from community to uplift the economic mobility of the community residents. So we don't want to say just, hey, well, when the building's built, then everything's fine, because it's not. And we also realize that by us doing the work that we've done, it has been a dog whistle to just the real estate community as a whole. So even when we won the Chicago Prize, we were the second winners of the Pritzker Traubert Chicago Prize, which is a $10 million investment in 3 physical projects and the Community Grocer Initiative. We started to see that language in the real estate listings. So hey, you want to live a block away from the Sankofa Wellness Village? It's coming, and there's a $60 million community area investment. We know that people are paying attention because of the work that we're doing, and simultaneously, the benefit hasn't happened yet. So we're still facing the opioid crisis. We're still facing food access issues. We're still facing all the things that we're facing. But meanwhile, we want to make sure that we are giving folks an opportunity for collective work and responsibility, for cooperative economics, to practice Sankofa and go back and get the things that are important for them, to practice respect. So within this park, and this is the project that I mentioned, this was a city-owned vacant lot. And when you go into it, it is off the corner of Madison and Pulaski, and it feels like an oasis. You do not feel like you are on the Madison corridor. It was intentional. It was intentional with the colors. It was intentional with the language. And so with that level of intentionality is how we have approached the food justice work, and bringing in partners and trying to make sure that we are creating opportunities for as many people to participate. I do want to make sure we leave time for questions. And please forgive me, Miss Angela. I was supposed to go back and update that email address. I want to make sure folks have your ability or the ability to participate in being able to contact us. And I don't know how do we manage the questions at this point? I do see a few that are in the chat. Could we all talk about the community engagement piece? Were there any folks that we were surprised that got engaged? What has youth engagement look like? Are there voices we think are missing from the table? Absolutely. Miss Angela, I'll let you start in answering that question while I get the glossary, and then I'll chime in on that.
Well, missing from the table is money. Okay, I'm a straight shooter, and sometimes it doesn't sound real pretty. It takes capital to do the things that we've already created, but we're of that mindset to plan it and keep it in place. So when the revenues, the resources do come, we can pull it, dust it off, and tweak it a little bit and be ready to implement. I would just encourage everyone in all communities, more affluent and less affluent, if there is such a thing here in Chicago. What can be created by the lock and step of the residents that live in the community can be magnificent. I'm very happy to be living in a community that was built up at one point, knocked down as another, and watching it to have a renaissance and be built up once again. Christyn, back to you, and thank you everyone for joining us.
I would say there's more youth engagement, and then there's more people that are still skeptical of systems. So those who might have been justice involved, how are we trying to get more youth? As I said, more adoption of social media. So we've been trying to think about engagement of influencers, and not like major influencers, but also major influencers who have the ear of folks, either those that are, I guess, more Chicago famous versus like neighborhood famous. So that's one mechanism. The other is, again, making sure that we are continuing to populate and try to identify additional evangelists. So there have been particular programs. There was a youth architecture program as a part of a portion of development. There has been a number of safety corridor walks, safety studies, affordable housing studies. Like we have been engaging. um, and as Miss Angela mentioned, all these efforts are not funded. Jim, if he were here, like that affordable housing study was something that he knew was important because we need to look at replacing the housing that are on the adjacent blocks for these developments before somebody else comes and does it who doesn't share the same values of Village and Sankofa that we have. The missing middle was influenced by our work. And so we are also making sure that we are in contact with the city. And that we are trying to look at additional programming. So from Fahodier's standpoint, and I know we got like a minute left, from Fahodier's standpoint, we've looked at additional programming to really tap in to more of those folks that are doing violence interrupter work, because their personal ecosystems are typically going to include some more people that are not coming to aldermanic meetings and who are not currently involved in this current community engagement piece, so that they can get informed of the messages and then broadcast that messaging as well. We have trained program participants who do have backgrounds to be able to do focus groups and surveys, and that happened before COVID. And so we're just trying to continue a level of the work that we've had the pleasure of being gifted to do. Thank you.
This has been an incredible presentation. I wanted to thank our presenters, Ms. Freemon, Ms. Taylor. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. If anyone has additional questions, please, feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to connect you afterwards. And please stay tuned. We've got more sessions later this afternoon as well. And then we have our in-person summit this Friday. We'd love to see everyone in person who can. Thank you so much again for coming today and sharing this information.
Thank you for having us.